Chapter 41 Refugees. Craig Rothburn's POV. I was furious and could barely stop myself from unsheathing my sword and taking this pompous asshole's head off. Not only did he deny us aid, but he also tried to ask for compensation for using their pylon. All we were trying to do was use the points we earned from hunting the beasts in the forest to buy food. 3 factions had already turned us down, but none of them were as rude as this asshole. He took what little power he had gotten and it went straight to his head. I was higher level than him and could kill him easily, but that wouldn't help matters. I could feel the urge to take my anger out on him rising as more words oozed out of his mouth. If this went on any longer, I might not be able to hold myself back. All the previous groups were polite and at least let us use their pylons, but this guy wanted to charge us a fee just for using it. One group even repaired all of our gear for us before we went on our way. That one was particularly heart-wrenching. I thought we had finally found a faction that would take us in after a week of traveling, but in the end, they came to the same conclusion as all the rest. The elder gentleman that I spoke with was civil at least, much better than this guy. The elderly gentleman I spoke to must have been an old grandpa before the system came. It was odd to see the effects that stats had on old age. I wasn't as young as I used to be, but my body felt better than ever and I was only middle-aged. Late middle-aged, but still middle-aged. He came with a group of the strongest people that I'd seen thus far in the tutorial. 2 people in particular stood out and I could still remember the feeling that they gave off, seemingly subconsciously. They were both level 22 and had a presence to them that I couldn't ignore. The reason I think it was a subconscious aura was because they didn't seem to be doing it on purpose. The blacksmith in particular was very polite and decent to talk to, yet the feeling persisted throughout the conversation. It was like facing down one of the monsters during the waves. No one else in our group felt it, but I knew it was there. I wasn't crazy. We had been traveling for a while by then and I was running on fumes, so that could have been it, but I didn't think so. All of the walking, along with making sure nobody fell behind, added to the job of keeping everyone safe. I didn't know how I was still going. Rebecca, my wife, was a bastion to lean on. If she wasn't here, I didn't know what I would have done. After the strong group and older man went back to discuss the request amongst themselves, I thought we had a decent chance of getting approval. They seemed like nice people and their camp looked pristine. Their wall in particular stood out and looked way different than the one that was around our camp. It must have been upgraded or something. They deliberated for a while before they came to break the news. Even though they said no, they still helped as much as they could. It was nice to see that even though the world had ended, there were still decent people. The hoping was the worst part. Every time we would stumble onto a faction, we all couldn't help but hope this was the one, only to be denied. Living in the wilderness was hard, and it was only going to get worse. Predators hunted you at all times of the day, and traveling at night was a good way to end up dead. Even with experience spending nights in the forest, people still disappeared at night. The monsters were getting stronger too. At first, they were easy enough to kill, but their levels increased with each passing day. Food was becoming an issue. As the monsters got stronger, we needed more people to take each one down. What was once 5 hunting groups of 4 people turned into 4 groups of 5 and lately 3 groups of 6 with some stragglers. With not as many groups hunting, we weren't bringing enough food in to feed all of us. That was why we had to supplement our hunting with buying food from the store. Which brought me back to the arrogant fool's incessant rambling. He was going on about how he was letting us use his pylon. If this was how he acted, I felt sorry for the people who lived here. We wouldn't survive until the next faction if we didn't restock at this one. So I had to grit my teeth and pay the outrageous fee. I swore to myself that I would get revenge on this asshole when I got the chance, and it made me feel better about paying him. When we initially lost our camp and so many of my family died, I wanted to take it out on the group we took in. It was their fault and I wanted them to pay. The only reason I calmed my anger was because Rebecca talked me out of it. Now that we were all traveling through the forest, we would need as many people as possible. If nothing else, then to act as a buffer. Under the guise of rotating shifts, I had them rotating between leading and bringing up the rear, just in case we got ambushed in the woods. It felt wrong to use them like that, but all I had to do was think of that night and the feeling went away. I couldn't stop picturing when walls came down and the monsters came through. When they broke through and got through the gate. The screams would haunt me forever. I could still taste the smoke in my throat and feel the heat from the fire. A stray firebolt had caught our huts on fire and the whole camp went up in flames. My back was still burned from trying to get as many of the kids out of the cabin as I could. We thought they would be safe in there, away from the fighting. We were wrong. When the cabin went up in flames, I dropped everything to rush toward it. I left the front lines and sprinted as fast as I could toward the burning structure. I didn't even say anything to my brother, who was fighting the beasts next to me at the time. I never saw him again. Aaliyah and Olivia were the only thing on my mind, and I wasn't going to let my little girls burn. That was a terrible way to go and a fate I wouldn't wish on anyone. Luckily, I got to my daughters before the building was too engulfed in the flames. After securing them and making sure they were safe, I went back to get as many as I could. I got fewer than I like to think about. Even with these magical stats and skills, suffocation was still deadly. I could hold my breath for a lot longer now, but it still wasn't infinite. All my levels and stats equated to nothing that night. Rebecca found me face down a foot into the doorway of the fire from another trip into the building. A burning log had fallen on my back and burnt through my clothes to the bone. I still had shooting pains in my back occasionally. I got it healed, but the burn scar remained, as would other scars. I think that was another reason that I didn't take my anger out on the Gavins. By the time I could get up and move around, my anger had faded. Now I was just sad. There was still anger. Oh, there was anger, but it wasn't the white-hot in-the-moment anger. No, it was the simmering rage that lay beneath the surface. My parents had died long before the system came in a car crash, but my brother left to join them that night. My nephew joined them not long after. I got him out of the cabin, but he didn't pull through. The fire had been too much for his small body to take. I didn't like to think about it. The burns, it was unpleasant. We had been struggling for a while before it finally came crashing down on us. My sister-in-law got trampled by a deer early on, and it had been downhill from there. We had never been the most orderly of families, and the apocalypse only exacerbated the issue. Everyone wanted to do things their own way, and that led to fights. What we should buy from the store, how many points each person would spend, who did what jobs. Everything led to a fight. No one wanted to skin the beasts for leather. No one wanted to go into the forest for food. No one wanted to get their hands dirty with work. If we weren't forced to defend ourselves from the monsters, they probably wouldn't want to kill anything either. I never realized how pampered we were before it was all taken away. The first few days were rough to get through, but after what happened on the third wave, people shaped up. Carly didn't deserve what happened. Trampled to death by monstrous deer wasn't a pretty way to go. My brother didn't take the death of his wife very well, and nearly killed himself trying to get revenge on the foul beasts before we stopped him. Even after what happened, everyone hoarded their points for personal gain, and it took yelling and screaming to get people to spend any on the wall we needed. We lost people almost every wave until we had some semblance of safety when we finally bought the wall. This whole thing felt like one long nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. What made matters worse was that no one helped us. We sent out letters asking for aid, or anything people could spare, and no one answered. When the Gavins initially showed up after the 10th wave, we thought it was because of our letter, not because they were refugees. We didn't think anything of it. We thought the more, the merrier. The more people we had, the easier the waves would be. Oh, how wrong we were. We just wanted to help them like we had been denied. No one could have guessed that decision would lead to our downfall. None of the refugees we took in were above level 12. At the time, it was below what most of our camp were at. That was one of the main reasons we took them in. If we were more powerful than them, we wouldn't have to worry as much about deceitfulness. From the way they looked when they arrived, it would be far-fetched to think they were there for malicious reasons, but I had my girls to worry about, so extra caution was necessary. It wasn't until later that I put together why they were so low level. All of their fighters died when they had to flee their camp. What we were left with were the people who weren't powerful enough to do anything. Every monster of the 11th wave was higher level than them. We had barely made it through the 10th wave, and what we thought would help doomed us to die. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. The only thing keeping me going was the thought of my family dying. Every time I pictured them being eaten by monsters, I found a little more in me to keep going. If they weren't here, I didn't think I could do this. Chapter 42. Ice Manipulation. Christopher's POV. Day 42. Huff, huff. My body hurt from the strain, but I powered through. Sweat was dripping down into my eyes, but I was almost done, and it would only take a little more. I was doing the best I could, and it was still threatening to fall apart. I could see parts of it shaking and about to fall. I had to double down and firm my grip to make sure that it all held. Hurry up. I don't know how much longer I can do this. My words fell on deaf ears. In no more of a hurry than before I spoke, she put the finishing touches on, taking her sweet time. Now that she was down, I could relax. It wouldn't do to have a little girl fall from that high. A round of applause rippled out from the crowd that gathered around us, and I carried Anna back to admire our work. It was flawless. The snowman reached over 12 feet tall, and the hat fit perfectly. Anna couldn't reach high enough to put the hat on, so I had to hold her up, while also holding the snowman together with ice manipulation. I never knew something so inconspicuous took so much effort. Creating the ice with hail was the easy part. Shaping it into what Anna considered the right shape was hard. I had to hold 3 separate balls of ice in the right shape before getting all of it according to her specifications. Admittedly, I could have made it easier on myself and done it one at a time, but that wasn't the point. Trying to think of ways to train ice manipulation was hard. I had just been juggling a few pieces in the air when the thought of making a snowman popped into my head. It was just a random thing to make, and I thought it would be funny, so I did it. Once Anna saw what I was doing, she demanded to be able to help. By help, she meant to take over. I had been using my skill to shape the ice into the right shape, but what I thought about how to do it was wrong apparently. Anna would shout out instructions of what to do and how I was doing it wrong. I would have to comply with her orders or face her wrath of pouting until I did what she said. How big it was, where it was placed, how oval wide it looked, even how round it was. I never knew there were so many specifications for a snowman. This was turning out to be a great way to train the skill. I could feel the strain of holding it all together simultaneously. When I first got the skill, I could barely shape the ice into what I wanted. Now, I could do it with much finer detail. It was still rough, but better than before. As my control increased, so did the range. The better I got at the skill, the further away I could control it. It still wasn't anything huge and only extended to about 15 feet, but it was farther than when the skill started. It started at 10 feet and it had already increased by 50%. Lack of familiarity in sensing the ice was the main reason I thought that it increased so quickly. That was also the reason it was so low to begin with. You couldn't manipulate what you couldn't feel. I didn't know how much my affinity was helping me, but I could feel the increase from day to day. I was getting better at it with each passing day and the more I practiced. My initial thought when I got the skill was to make weapons made of ice and wield them instead of my axe. I wouldn't have to worry about my axe breaking if I could make one out of ice. That idea didn't pan out well. I could do it, but it was fragile. I should have known that if I was deforming iron with my swings, ice wouldn't fare any better. For some reason, I thought magic ice would be different. Instinctively, I knew there was a way to strengthen it, but I wasn't there yet. It had only been a few days since I got the skill, and asking it to hold up to my strength was a bit much. The ice was most effective being shot out at my targets. I didn't know if it was my familiarity with firearms that was the reason why this was the most effective, or if it was something else. Shaping the ice into an icicle wasn't that hard, and then all I had to do was shoot it away from me. Aiming was something to get used to, but it wasn't that bad. What surprised me was that what I was doing was considered throwing. How I knew that was because throwing weapon proficiency activated when I did it for the first time. The skill had a subtle activation, but I could feel it, and I saw the bonus was applied because the icicle flew faster. After some testing, it revealed it only activated when the ice left my range of manipulation. I guess it wasn't considered throwing if I could still manipulate it. Anything over 15 feet was considered a throw, for whatever reason. I didn't consider it throwing, but I wasn't going to say anything. Looking back on it now, I wanted to slap past me. Throwing weapon proficiency was not a very useful skill, and I could have picked something far better if I'd known more. I think it was a mixture of not wanting to get up close and personal with the monsters while also wanting a ranged skill that I even chose it. It would have been a useful skill if my main way to attack was with throwing knives or throwing axes, but it wasn't. I still used the skill almost every fight, but there were better ones out there I could have gotten. Live and learn, I guess. Seeing how effective my makeshift ice bolt was, I ended up purchasing the skill version of it. The waves having more and more monsters had the side effect of giving me more and more points after I killed them. I was swimming in the points lately and I still had some left over after buying 2 skills. With the new price tag of 5,000 points a skill, I had to be a little more cautious of what I got. I still had impulsive feelings toward certain skills, but I worked to curb them into something useful. Meditation was the first one I bought. Seeing how effective it was after Austin got it, it was a no-brainer. I had initially dismissed the skill because I didn't think that it would be useful. Yeah, increased mana regen and healing sounded good, but I didn't have a lot of skills that used mana initially and we had healers for healing. I wouldn't need the increased regeneration if we had healers and I didn't use mana. How short-sighted that was. Meditation was better than I originally gave it credit for. Now with the disparity in levels between me and the healers, it was more important than ever to have a way to heal myself. It was by no means quick, but Austin was up and walking around after the 10th wave while I was still bedridden. After using the skill for a few hours, he was in good enough shape to fight again. He wasn't good enough to fight off another wave, but enough to be useful in a fight if it came to that. I, on the other hand, was useless for over a day. A feeling that didn't give off happy and warm thoughts while I was lying in bed. The skill was straightforward and there wasn't much else to say about it. I had been using it more frequently after I got ice manipulation. It was easy to get carried away while practicing and run out of mana. The second skill I bought was Ice Bolt. I wanted a faster way to use my icicles as a weapon, and a skill that formed them for me was perfect. My affinity made the skill more effective and it paired well with ice manipulation. I had compared with Alice on whose skill was better and I beat her easily. She had more magic stats than I did but didn't have the affinity for ice that I did. I thought for sure that she would, given that she had multiple ice skills, but she didn't. Her affinity was for water. She said that it kind of felt like it helped, but not by much. I thought it was all in her head because the results were clear. My ice bolt was all around better than hers. It was faster than hers and it did more damage. Turning off ice manipulation evened the odds and made hers just barely better. I had the affinity and my higher level to negate the fact she had higher magic stats. If we had the same magic stats, it wouldn't even be close. It seemed that having an affinity for the element drastically increased its power. Surprising, I know, but the difference was clear when seeing it side by side. There had to be a reason that my skill did so well compared to hers. At first, I thought that magic was just a matter of having the higher intelligence stat, but that proved false. She had over double the amount of intelligence that I had, and it still turned out that way. There had to be something else at play, like strength of spirit or something. The spirit seems to be the commonality over everything we've learned so far. The guide in the White Room at the beginning mentioned it, and the alien Sipterus said something about it during his class. It seemed like a bigger deal than what we were giving it credit for. But how was my spirit stronger? Was it my total stats? So many questions and so few answers. I guess stats weren't everything. I pulled up my status to look at it now that I was thinking about it. Name, Christopher Zelensky. Race, G. Human. Class, G. Arctic Barbarian. Uncommon. Level 22. Profession, G. Novice Blacksmith. Common. Level 14. Faction, Zelensky family. Temporary. Strength, 140. Agility 58. Perception 16. Fortitude 64. Endurance 78. Vitality 40. Intelligence 15. Wisdom 20. Acumen 16. Free points 0. Laws none. Class skills: heavy blow, uncommon; fortified body, common; throwing weapon proficiency, beginner; identify, common; penetrating strike, common; sweeping slash, common; ice wall, common; heavy armor proficiency, beginner; heavy weapon proficiency, novice; body of a barbarian, uncommon; barbarian's rage, common; hail, common; Ice manipulation, common. Meditation, common. Ice bolt, common. Profession skills. Sense metal, common. Create weapon, crude. Create armor, crude. My stats had exploded over the past 4 waves. Carrying the momentum from the 10th wave where I got 3 levels, I got 2 more per wave until the 13th. I had only gotten 1 level in the last 2 waves, bringing me to level 22. I was getting closer to the next evolution and I couldn't help but note the blank section on my status. Laws, none. The coins section was also blank, but that was different. Coins were the currency of the multiverse and we weren't able to get them while we remained in the tutorial. The law section remaining blank kept drawing my eye and it stuck out like a sore thumb. My skills were this overflowing list while the laws remained blank. I knew that my feats were incorporated into what kind of evolution I got, and it was grating to think that I would evolve again while leaving it blank. No one in our camp had a law, so it wasn't like I was behind or anything, but it was still annoying to look at. I wanted to get the strongest evolution I could, and a law would help. I wouldn't go for anything fancy like karma or divination, but was an ice law too much to ask for? I would have to do something to fix that. Maybe Austin had some ideas. I wonder when everyone else in the multiverse gets a law? Coins, 0. Points, 7,671. Chapter 43, Tranquil Thoughts. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Repeat. This wasn't working. It was extremely boring to sit and do nothing for an extended period of time, especially after I had been so active in these last few weeks. If this was before, it wouldn't be so bad. Lying around and watching a TV show or reading something was a great way to pass the time. It felt like torture to bring me out of a sedentary life, hand me cool magical skills, make me fight for my life almost daily, and then ask me to sit still and think about some unknown magical law. I had to admit that I didn't know what I was doing either. In books, the main character just sits down for a few minutes and magically understands. That wasn't how it worked in real life. Sitting and thinking really hard about it didn't make me understand it any better. I wasn't going to just magically understand a law by sitting and pondering about it. That was absurd. That was like having no introduction to calculus and trying to learn it through meditation. It was crazy people would do that. I admit I had 0 experience with anything regarding a law, but how hard could it be? I knew how ice formed, the freezing temperature of water, hell, I even knew the density, which is lower than water if you were curious, which is why it floats. Ice that's most commonly found in nature is not the ice that I was envisioning while I was meditating. Any ice that wasn't clear had air bubbles in it that would compromise the structure. I remember taking a fluids class in college where this came up, something about water holding too much air in it and having to expel it while it froze. The exact details were a little fuzzy since the class was a couple of semesters ago. It was the clear ice that I was trying to picture. Sitting and thinking about everything I knew about ice yielded no results. I had better things to do than to sit here and accomplish nothing. Now that I thought about it, maybe not. My armor was made, my axe reforged in steel, and everyone had new weapons to use. There was nothing actively pressing that I had to get done before tomorrow's wave. The previous 3 waves went down easily enough and I didn't have a feeling of imminent dread. I needed to get this law thing figured out soon if I wanted to get it before I evolved. If I continued receiving a level a wave, then I would evolve in 3 waves. That gave me 7 days to figure it out. Not a lot of time when you thought about it. Wave 15 came tomorrow with wave 16 in 4 days and the 17th in a week. That was also relying on no changes to the waves as well. Wave 10 introduced a new variable, and with a milestone wave coming up, something else could change, ruining my time clock. If there was a change in tomorrow's wave, I didn't think that it would be anything huge or I would feel it. I wasn't positive how my spidey senses worked, but they were spot on for the 10th wave. I could be in the forge trying to level my profession as soon as possible or training, ice manipulation, but I needed a break from that. I had been doing those exact 2 things for the past few days and I was tired of it. It was inevitable that I would have to go back and work on them again, but I needed a break right now, something to freshen me up and give my mind a break. My eyes drifted north toward the mountains. The Forbidden Mountains. That title sounded cliché, but it was the truth. Ever since we saw how high of a level the monsters there were, venturing there was forbidden. No one had to say anything about not going there, but it was implied. Everyone had enough common sense not to venture too far in that direction. The beasts were too powerful back then, but maybe not anymore. The beasts were past the evolution threshold and were in the F rank, but I had gotten a lot more powerful since then. I faced boss monsters that were almost that high, and they were more powerful than normal monsters. The last wave, Wave 14, had a boss at level 24, one level shy of the threshold. Oh, I didn't think about that. Tomorrow's wave would have a boss past that threshold. How could that have slipped my mind? The level 24 boss from the last wave was difficult to put down even while working together with Austin. Jonathan even got involved at one point, but he couldn't handle the fight for long. Being a shield warrior made him a really good tank, doubly so with his earth affinity. The only problem was his low level. He had been gaining on me after every wave and was only a few levels behind me now at level 20, but it was still a 4-level gap behind the boss. It was annoying that I was doing everything I could to level up and get stronger, and he was gaining on me. He didn't even have an uncommon class like me. Maybe that was the reason. Who knows? Now that we had enough personal points to buy whatever profession starter that we wanted, Austin and Jonathan finally obtained their professions. No one else wanted to be an explorer, so Austin had to buy his outright. That left him one skill behind me in total, since I had more points to spend than him. He was happy with his choice, and I wasn't going to say anything about it. It didn't seem like it would be very easy to level while we were here in the tutorial, but it wasn't my decision. Jonathan, on the other hand, went a bit more practical with his profession and chose merchant. He had been a salesman before the tutorial, and it translated well into merchant. A few others in the family wanted to be merchants, so he didn't have to foot the bill for the entire book by himself. There weren't a lot of opportunities to level up that profession like explorer, but there were things he could do. If I had him purchase everything I needed for the forge, he got experience for that. He got a discount in the store based on his level, so it was beneficial for me as well. Trading with the few messengers we had received was another thing that he could do to level up. I didn't know if giving the refugees aid counted as experience as a merchant or not. I didn't ask him. Anything revolving around trading or purchasing resources was in his wheelhouse though, and he seemed to know what he was doing. With their new professions, they had more stats to fight with, and Jonathan wasn't as far behind. It showed in his help with the boss. He could only tank a few hits, but it was better than nothing. It let me have free rein to attack however I wanted for a few moments, and that led to some deep wounds to start the fight. I didn't know how well that would translate to an F-ranked beast though. When we were fighting the evolved boar, when we were below level 10, it was a slog, and F rank was supposed to be worse. Every time you evolved, the gap got steeper and steeper. H to G rank wasn't that bad of a jump, G to F was bigger. Something like A to S rank was near insurmountable for most people. Only someone with a high rarity class at a tier could make the jump, and the S tier would have to have a low rarity class to make it possible. There were always outliers, but those were the exceptions to the rule. Having the boss split its attention 3 ways was a lot easier than when it was just the 2 of us. We had range support from Hal, Carrie, and Rachel, but it wasn't the same. They were up on the wall shooting from safety. We were down with the beast trying not to get eaten. After thinking about it, we should be fine. I had a host of new skills, and I knew the other 2 did as well. Ice manipulation helped strengthen Ice Wall into a defensive ability strong enough that could hold off a boss's attack or 2. Rage was a nice boost, and with my strength stat still climbing, the boost got better at every level. With a strength stat of 140, the boosting skill brought it up to 154. It added over 4 levels worth of strength in a single skill. It added more stats than what I initially started with. I was looking forward to seeing what my new magic attack would do. I wasn't expecting Ice Bolt to be insanely powerful, but it should be able to do some damage. Throw the boss out of rhythm unexpectedly, or use it to target a vulnerable part while it was distracted. I had a lot more options in combat now that I had a decent number of skills to back me up. Depending on how the boss went, maybe we could start going up into the mountains for our hunting trips. It was getting harder to find worthy prey in the forest, and we usually had to settle for level 20 or so beasts. The forest just didn't have that many high-level monsters in it for us to hunt. We wiped out most of the more powerful ones already. The level 15 bear that scared us so much in the beginning was long dead, and its hide used for armor. I think Scott has that set if I'm not mistaken. The mountains might hold the key to gaining a law before my evolution. It was the only place that had snow near here, and maybe being in the environment might spark something. Gah! I wish this wasn't so hard. It felt like I was guessing at what might work when I knew for a fact people already had the answer I was looking for. If only the system wasn't so stingy. Laws didn't come into play until the evolution to E rank, but maybe the environment was different. I'd read cultivation stories where people gain enlightenment from watching a waterfall of some shit, so maybe that was the answer. It didn't matter if it wasn't helpful. Anything was better than sitting here and thinking about it. Some hiking might do me good. Chapter 44 Blizzard. You've got to be shitting me. I couldn't help but mutter. It was day 43 and I was currently watching the 15th wave spawn in. It went how all of the others had started, except for one small difference. Over 120 spotted coming over the east hills. Hal shouted out. Now that wouldn't sound that bad. And with only 120 in the wave, it sounded quite good. The last wave had over 250 beasts, so it seemed like a drop in difficulty. But that wasn't taking into consideration the 130 monsters we were watching run toward us. From the west. They were coming from two directions. The waves had followed a strict clockwise pattern since the beginning. East, south, west, north in that order. Besides the pylon upgrades, every wave rotated following that pattern. Today's wave was supposed to come from the west. We were all in formation facing west. I knew there would be a change this wave, but I didn't think it would be this. It would split our forces in two opposite directions. I turned to Austin, looking to see how we were going to do this. Usually, I would be the tip of the spear in our three-man formation while fighting the waves. This would break us up. I'll go to the east. I'm faster, he said. The beasts were still a ways away, but they would close in quick. I could make it across the camp to the eastern gate in enough time, but he would be quicker at it. Take Jonathan with you, I said. He would need him more than I would. I could tank for myself while also dishing out damage, and Austin was more oriented toward dealing damage. It wasn't to say he couldn't take damage, it just wasn't his strong suit. These waves were a marathon, not a sprint. I didn't know if he would be able to last the whole wave by himself. He was damn strong, but I couldn't help worrying about him. We had grown close fighting together, closer than the 2 decades we spent together before. I don't need him, he can stay here with you, Austin replied. Guys, I'm right here, Jonathan said. I guess it was kind of rude to talk about him like he wasn't standing right next to us. He'll interfere with my blizzard. Take him, I said. It was a flimsy reason, but a reason nonetheless. Austin made to answer but sighed instead. Fine. Stay safe and don't do anything I wouldn't do, Austin said, looking at me with a smirk. That wasn't saying much. There wasn't a lot that he wouldn't do. Before they walked too far away toward the eastern gate, I caught Austin's eye. I motioned with my head toward Jonathan with a look that said, "Take care of him." He got what I was implying and gave me a slight nod before turning fully and running away. It was usually me who made sure that Jonathan stayed safe, but I would have to delegate that task to Austin. A part of me was glad that he agreed to take him. 2 was better than 1, and Jonathan wasn't the detriment that he started out as. After 4 grueling waves of fighting off hundreds of monsters, he was pulling his own. He could handle himself, and I was hoping he could help Austin if the need arose. The blizzard I was talking about was a new technique that I would be trying out this wave. Ice manipulation training had been going really well, and I had enough control to use the technique. The name was self-explanatory of what it was. Using hail, I would rain down ice to start the wave, then, using ice manipulation, I would pick up all the ice I could and spin it around me as fast as I could. A blizzard. I still couldn't control that many projectiles while spinning them around myself, but I was getting better. I had noticed over the fights that when I used hail extensively, I fought better. I didn't know quite what it was, but it felt more free or natural. It was dancing in a stuffy room compared to an open stage. I couldn't think about it anymore before the beasts closed in. It was time to shine. My attention wasn't focused on who all left the western gate to head east, so I wasn't aware of who was still here. The only ones that really mattered were Hal, Carrie, and Rachel anyway, and I should find out soon. It wasn't a big deal. I just wanted to know if I should watch out for Rachel's fireballs. She had this nasty habit of melting all my damn ice. I would throw down a hail around me and she'd think it was a perfect time for an overpowered fireball to come melt it all. It was frustrating. We were both fighting over the same thing with our mana and I would always lose. Temperature. It was a game of control and I had the odds stacked against me. She was way better at controlling mana than I was and she had the magic stats to back it up. It was like trying to play tug of war against someone with one hand tied behind my back. Every time a fire skill came near me, it made it that much harder to use my ice skills. Fire mana and ice mana didn't mix and were polar opposites. Literally. If I saturated an area with ice mana, Rachel would first have to force the mana back to neutral, then use her fire skills. She could still throw fireballs in an area with ice mana, they were just less effective. The same went for me. After finding out that fun tidbit of information, I had been training to rectify that weakness. When I could find the time, I would spar with Rachel. It wasn't normal sparring but manipulation sparring. She had fire manipulation, and we would battle against each other for control over the temperature using our respective skills. Honestly, it was the main reason I got so good at ice manipulation. It was like extreme resistance training but for my skill. I had yet to beat her. I wasn't mad about it or anything. No, it makes sense, the more powerful and higher level one should lose. Perfect sense. While in the smithy, I battled against the fire heating the forge. It wasn't a sentient flame so it didn't fight back. But it was something to practice against. Everything in the world interacted with mana, or so Cipterus said, and the fire in the forge produced fire mana, or changed neutral mana into fire mana. It wasn't clear. I had been fading by information overload by that part of the lecture. I would have to ask Abigail, she would know. I had already started swinging at the first few unlucky lizard monsters who reached me while I was thinking about all that, and I took a minute to really look at the beasts. They were the biggest lizards I had ever seen before and came up to my chest in height. It was unnatural for lizards to be as big as me. The closest thing I could think of was Komodo dragons, but a lot bigger and more vicious, and had a mouth like a velociraptor. There were a lot of differences actually, but I was no zoologist. The one thing I did know was they had dark earthy tones to their scales, and it didn't take a genius to guess what that meant. So it wasn't a surprise when an earth spike came flying at me, confirming their earth affinity. Yeah, that was another thing that changed over the waves. The monsters were getting better at magic. They were still limited to simple manipulations, but I could see how it would evolve in later tiers. Not all of the waves had such obvious themes. The wolves of Wave 10 didn't have an affinity I could identify. The wildcats of 11 had a small air affinity and some threw weak air blades, but they weren't strong and less than half did it. It seemed the beginning monsters focused on other areas than magic, and that was beginning to change. In the current waves, some of the beasts were normal monsters using their bodies to fight, but some were more magically inclined and threw magic from a distance. They were starting to break into archetypes and not the good kind. It was great when we did it, but unfair when the monsters did it. Call me a hypocrite all you like, it was bullshit. That was the main reason I was practicing with Rachel as much as I was. I didn't want to find myself in a situation where I couldn't use my skills effectively. Like if we were up against hellhounds, or wolves with fire for fur, or fire-breathing lizards. Frankly, there were a lot of possibilities. I wanted to train my control now so I wouldn't be sorry later. I would have the advantage if I could force them to fight in an unfair environment. Now that there was a decent buildup of beasts around me, I began my technique. Massive chunks of ice fell from the sky, injuring any beast unlucky enough to be hit. I funneled a decent amount of mana into hail before I cut it off after a few moments. I didn't want to blow all of my mana. After the hail stopped, I used ice manipulation to pick up the pieces. It was considerably harder while in the middle of a fight, but nothing I hadn't trained for. Ice manipulation still took mana to use, but it wasn't a lot. I didn't have to create the ice, only move it around. I had to initially shape it into decent projectiles, but that didn't take very long and wasn't a constant mana drain. It only took an initial amount of mana to shape it into what I wanted. The shape I was going for was kind of funny really, at least to me it was. At first, I thought icicles would do best, but I was wrong. I didn't have the focus to make sure they were all facing the right way while I was in battle. While spinning, some would flip around and face backward or fly sideways. They were of no use if the sharp end wasn't leading. After that failure, I switched to something more circular. Shurikens were my first thought. Saw blades would work, but I didn't want to create all of the teeth, and I had to spin them. Ninja stars. I thought they were super cool when I was a kid, and I used to make paper versions of them in school when I was little. I mean, who wouldn't want to use ninja stars in battle? After I began making them while I was practicing, I thought of something else that would work and decided on that instead. Snowflakes. Giant sharpened snowflakes. They took longer to make than the shurikens did, but it was worth it. There was something poetic about using something so beautiful for something so brutal. I thought it was hilarious, and that's all that really matters. I had nice big pretty snowflakes, and I used them to murder animals and rip them limb from limb. It sounded darker than what it really was. Or my mental state wasn't what it used to be. Who's to say? Murdering thousands of beasts will do that. I formed as many as I could from the ice available and started to spin them around me. I had to keep them higher in the air so they would miss the beasts to begin, so they would build up momentum. They got going quick enough to be lethal without getting stuck, so I began my dance. Calling it a dance wasn't technically accurate, but if I was using big sharp snowflakes to kill things, I could call it whatever I wanted. The snowflakes lowered into position and began slicing through monsters. Blood flew freely and monsters died quickly. It was a blizzard of gore. Chapter 45, 15th Wave. My blizzard was less effective than I wanted it to be. The ice still easily broke if it hit wrong, and the number of projectiles could use some work. I was spinning them as fast as I could while keeping them under control, and that led to less than stellar results. If it hit a weak spot, it would cut deep and leave a bleeding wound, but if it hit heavily defended spots, the ice would shatter. I tried to pick them up and reform them when I could, but that was something I couldn't afford to split my attention on very often. My melee skills were suffering to compensate for the ice show, and against anything stronger, it would be detrimental. It was my first time using the skill, so there were still kinks to iron out. Seeing how the technique wasn't as effective as I wanted it to be, I dropped it. No use in splitting my attention on something that wasn't as good as me fighting normally. I went back to my tried and true method, wholesale slaughter. It was the main reason I liked my axe so much. With the augmentation from sweeping/extending the blade, I had a large radius around me where things spontaneously died. My new steel axe held up a lot better to the strain, but I could tell it would fail after repeated stress. It would last this wave and maybe the next wave, but probably not the third. Thinking about it made me sigh. Yes, in the middle of battle surrounded by beasts, I was sighing about the futility of my axe. With the upgrade to village, we got an increased assortment of profession materials and better metals were available to use. It would just take a long time to learn what they were and how best to forge with them. Metallurgy would help, and I was close to getting another professional skill. It was just an effort I didn't want to make. I could feel my drive diminishing after the days of pushing myself as hard as I could. It had been weeks of spending every waking hour doing everything I could to improve. It was starting to feel hopeless. Every time we got a handle on something, it changed. I was staying ahead of the waves and could fight them off, but then they changed to double in difficulty, outpacing me. These last two waves I only leveled once and the monsters gained on me. I didn't know much else I could do. Was I doomed to fight against higher-level enemies no matter what I did? It felt like this whole thing was orchestrated to slowly wear you down before you gave up. I had to do it, though. If I didn't, the consequences were death. And not just my death, the death of my family. The fighting had gone on for over half an hour by now, and the numbers were thinning. I was getting better at fighting for extended periods of time with all the practice. I felt sorry for anything that tried to force me into a battle of attrition. With the bodies clearing, I started to look for the boss. It was around this time that it would make its appearance. The beasts would throw themselves at us for almost an hour depending on how many there were and how fast they died. Then the boss would show up. As I surveyed the land, a feeling bubbled within me. I couldn't place its origin, but it was something like pride. I was in a battlefield rent with destruction, and I was the one left standing. Felt good. Bodies were strewn about in various states of destruction, and blood coated the ground. Leftover ice from my opening move was scattered about, tinted red from the blood. I didn't spot the boss, so it must have spawned on the other side. The bosses were easy to spot, and I wouldn't overlook its oversized frame. Austin and Jonathan knew what they were doing. They could handle it. I knew it was evolved and in a higher rank, but they could always retreat if they had to. After I finished up here, I'd head over there. I didn't want to deplete all of my mana, but seeing as the boss wasn't here, I could afford to be less frugal. It felt good fighting in the Arctic conditions, and I couldn't help but resonate with my class name. I channeled up a bigger-than-average hail and got to work. Fighting in the ice storm was all around better than fighting without. I felt more invigorated, better aware of my surroundings, and more at home. It was like home field advantage during sports games. My blizzard was less effective than I wanted it to be. The ice still easily broke if it hit wrong, and the number of projectiles could use some work. I was spinning them as fast as I could while keeping them under control, and that led to less than stellar results. If it hit a weak spot, it would cut deep and leave a bleeding wound, but if it hit heavily defended spots, the ice would shatter. I tried to pick them up and reform them when I could, but that was something I couldn't afford to split my attention on very often. My melee skills were suffering to compensate for the ice show, and against anything stronger, it would be detrimental. It was my first time using the skill, so there were still kinks to iron out. Seeing how the technique wasn't as effective as I wanted it to be, I dropped it. No use in splitting my attention on something that wasn't as good as me fighting normally. I went back to my tried and true method, wholesale slaughter. It was the main reason I liked my axe so much. With the augmentation from sweeping/extending the blade, I had a large radius around me where things spontaneously died. My new steel axe held up a lot better to the strain, but I could tell it would fail after repeated stress. It would last this wave and maybe the next wave, but probably not the third. Thinking about it made me sigh. Yes, in the middle of battle surrounded by beasts, I was sighing about the futility of my axe. With the upgrade to village, we got an increased assortment of profession materials, and better metals were available to use. It would just take a long time to learn what they were and how best to forge with them. Metallurgy would help, and I was close to getting another professional skill. It was just an effort I didn't want to make. I could feel my drive diminishing after the days of pushing myself as hard as I could. It had been weeks of spending every waking hour doing everything I could to improve. It was starting to feel hopeless. Every time we got a handle on something, it changed. I was staying ahead of the waves and could fight them off, but then they changed to double in difficulty, outpacing me. These last two waves I only leveled once, and the monsters gained on me. I didn't know much else I could do. Was I doomed to fight against higher-level enemies no matter what I did? It felt like this whole thing was orchestrated to slowly wear you down before you gave up. I had to do it, though. If I didn't, the consequences were death. And not just my death, the death of my family. The fighting had gone on for over half an hour by now, and the numbers were thinning. I was getting better at fighting for extended periods of time with all the practice. I felt sorry for anything that tried to force me into a battle of attrition. With the bodies clearing, I started to look for the boss. It was around this time that it would make its appearance. The beasts would throw themselves at us for almost an hour, depending on how many there were and how fast they died. Then the boss would show up. As I surveyed the land, a feeling bubbled within me. I couldn't place its origin, but it was something like pride. I was in a battlefield rent with destruction, and I was the one left standing. Felt good. Bodies were strewn about in various states of destruction, and blood coated the ground. Leftover ice from my opening move was scattered about, tinted red from the blood. I didn't spot the boss, so it must have spawned on the other side. The bosses were easy to spot, and I wouldn't overlook its oversized frame. Austin and Jonathan knew what they were doing. They could handle it. I knew it was evolved and in a higher rank, but they could always retreat if they had to. After I finished up here, I'd head over there. I didn't want to deplete all of my mana, but seeing as the boss wasn't here, I could afford to be less frugal. It felt good fighting in the Arctic conditions, and I couldn't help but resonate with my class name. I channeled up a bigger-than-average hail and got to work. Fighting in the ice storm was all around better than fighting without. I felt more invigorated, better aware of my surroundings, and more at home. It was like home field advantage during sports games. Austin charged in quick and launched a few spears empowered with sunlight, dancing around the boss trying to stay in its blind spot. Everything looked fine until the boss, the lumbering giant it was, swatted him with its tail so fast I could hardly track it. As fast as Austin was, he couldn't dodge the tail and he was sent flying. Now I knew why he was so far away. This wasn't the first time the boss had done this. Seeing how ineffective Austin was, I searched for Jonathan. Unease was rising in my heart the longer it took to find him, and I feared the worst. He wasn't as strong as Austin and the boss could have killed him. I scoured the battlefield with my eyes, but I couldn't find the man. He was nowhere to be found and my dread kept rising. Abigail will be crushed. Wait a minute, where's Abigail? She wasn't with the other healers attending to Carrie and I couldn't find her up on the wall. I couldn't waste time searching for them anymore, so I got the attention of one of my cousins. Bradley was just standing on the wall watching. He was a mage, so he should have been firing off spells or doing something at least, but he was shaking in fear. He was the youngest of my Uncle Mark's kids and was a very timid person. I was surprised he was up here at all. I didn't think I'd heard him speak since his dad died. Getting his attention was easy with a firm shake. "Explain what happened," I demanded. Took a moment for him to comprehend what I said before he started talking. He was a stammering fit of nerves and I could barely understand a word he was saying. "Take a deep breath and speak clearly." I tried not to yell at him, but he was making it hard. After the B-boss got close, Jonathan and Austin went to attack it. Its first swing sent Jonathan flying over the wall and into C camp. Abigail rushed off to go heal him while Austin stayed behind. He was calmer but still carried a stutter. It explained where my sister was and why I couldn't find Jonathan. Jonathan was tough and I knew he wouldn't die so easily, so some of my unease settled. I didn't know if I could take seeing Anna and Josh find out their dad was dead. Shaking off those worries, I focused on the lumbering beast. I didn't have any more time to get anything else out of Bradley. The boss was closing in. I didn't want to find out how effective its earth powers were on the wall. I would have to get in there and I only had a few seconds to come up with a game plan. It had a mouth full of teeth that could bite me along with earth-shaping abilities I would have to be wary of. Also, its tail was more dangerous than it let on and it was quicker than I gave it credit for. Wonderful. Well, here goes nothing. Chapter 46, Ice Wall. Jumping down from the wall, I took my time approaching the beast. Identify was unhelpful and came back with something I hadn't seen before. Level 25. Question marks were a new feature. The power disparity along with the rank disparity made it so that I couldn't even see what the thing was called. I got its level though, which seemed backward. You'd think it would tell me what it was and not its level if I was only going to get one of them. When I originally assessed the likelihood of my axe failing, taking into account fighting this thing wasn't considered. The rock armor covered what had to be just as hard scales underneath, and hitting them wouldn't be good for the longevity of my axe. Jesus, I might as well start making hammers, it's what they end up as anyway. I had nothing against hammers, it's just that I was more familiar with an axe. I could make it a lot bigger. If I didn't have to worry about the balance of the blade, I could create a hammer heavy enough to match my strength. Creating an axe that heavy was getting increasingly difficult. I didn't want to swing around some light toothpick of a weapon when I had the strength to spare. I would have to forego the spike and make it double-headed for stability. I could make it thicker so it would last and I could use more metal for increased damage. Thinking about it made me excited to start making it. Plans swirled around in my head and I started envisioning a massive warhammer. I wouldn't have to stick to human standards like people in the medieval ages did. I could make it match my inhuman strength. If I made the face of the hammer too big, it would lessen the impact of my blows. I would have to find the sweet spot through testing. Ending the thoughts on my next weapon, I centered my attention entirely on the boss. Seeing how it manhandled Austin, I activated Barbarian's Rage before even crossing blades with it. Underestimating it wouldn't be a good way to start the fight. I felt my blood pump quicker and my body strengthened from the skill and fought the emotional effects that were brought with it. After testing the skill and training to fight through the side effects, the rage was more of a backseat driver than what it first was. It was still there and I could tap into it if I needed it, but I kept it at arm's length. I was the one who needed to be in control and I didn't want to be governed by the skill. With the boost applied, I charged at the boss. I needed to stop it from reaching the wall, and it was treating the trench as little more than a speed bump. The trench did not affect the beast, and it easily stepped over the hard work we spent days digging. I was the only thing between it and the wall. I powered up my axe with heavy blow and penetrating strike, watching it start to glow, wincing at the inefficiencies of my skills as the axe glowed brighter. My control was better, but still not enough. My limit had increased, and I could run 4 skills at the same time. The 4 I was currently using were the 2 offensive skills I just applied with Fortified Body for defense. Rage took up the last slot. I had been experimenting on ways to upgrade the skills I already had, but nothing came to fruition. I didn't really understand how they worked fully, and the skill I already upgraded felt more like a fluke than anything to go off of. When I upgraded Power Strike into Heavy Blow, I was desperate. I tried to put everything I had into the skill to make it more powerful, and I wasn't in the best state of mind when I did it. I hadn't been able to replicate the feat since. Seeing the description for the upgraded Penetrating Strike on the list of available skills as Frostbite, I attempted to do the upgrade manually. I wouldn't have to waste a skill slot on it if I could do it myself. As wishful thinking as that was, nothing came out of it. I just couldn't get the skill to do what I wanted it to. Filling it with mana and getting it to disperse into what I hit wasn't that hard to figure out. It was the lasting ice damage that was stumping me. Something about my mana wouldn't do it. Just shoving mana into something wouldn't work. My mana didn't carry any inherent effect, and I couldn't get it to do what I wanted. Trying to use it to freeze something didn't work. My mana wasn't entirely ice mana. It was like the mana I absorbed from the air was neutral, and as it entered my body it was colored by my affinity instead of becoming my affinity. It was like a watered-down version of the real thing. I didn't know what I was doing wrong, though. Was my affinity too weak, or was something else the problem? Did I need an ice law to convert my mana into real ice mana? One thing I did note was the longer I went without using mana, the higher the solution was concentrated if we were using the same watered-down analogy. I was curious to see what would happen if I absorbed actual ice mana to start with. All the mana I regenerated was taken from the surroundings, and the only thing here was earth, nature, and plant mana. Would mana if you went into the forest? To make a long story short, I couldn't upgrade my skill manually. At least not yet. So it was with the 2 skills that I had used with the previous 5 waves that I attacked the boss. I could see Austin running back toward us from where the boss had launched him, and knew I only needed to hold it off. The lizard extended its body and made to bite me, to which I responded with a heavy downswing with my axe. The resounding clang from the clash rang through the air and rattled my eardrums. I felt the vibration travel down my arms from where I held the axe. Damn, this thing's tough. I hadn't expected much, but seeing how little it was affected was disappointing. The strength of my swing halted its attack but did little else. No wound was left, and it didn't seem like the armor was impacted in any way. After its failed attack with its mouth, the boss spun around to hit me with its tail. I had seen this move when Austin went flying and knew it was coming. Fortified Body was active, and I crouched slightly to brace for the impact. Not a single part of me thought to dodge. I knew it was too fast, and if Austin couldn't do it, I sure as hell couldn't. I raised my axe to meet it and was in the best position possible to deflect the blow. It happened in a blink. 1 second I was hearing the tail whistle through the air, and the next, a thundering impact shook me to the core. My bones ached and my arms lost feeling in them from the impact. I was pushed several feet back and only barely kept my feet. I angled my axe so the blow would deflect up over my head, and that was the only reason I didn't go flying. The downward force kept my feet on the ground. The boss seemed stunned that I didn't get launched into the air like it did to its previous 2 attackers. It took it as an affront and increased its effort to send me flying. The boss was so quick I could do little else but defend. My axe handle was groaning from the trial I was putting it through, and the only reason it hadn't splintered into a million pieces was the mana I was running through it. I had to deflect every swipe and bite to miss my body by mere inches. If I got the angle wrong and took a blow straight on, I would lose my footing. Even by deflecting the blows, the boss was pushing me around the battlefield. Every impact sent me sliding back, every blow pushing me further away. I was doing my best, but my skills were barely up to the task. I was usually the one in the power position, using my strength to overwhelm foes. It didn't feel good to be on the other shoe. Any chance I got to attack just clanged off its rocky exterior, causing no lasting damage. It was worse than facing the boar. I had underestimated the impact evolving to F rank would have. The only thing I was doing was keeping its attention. It seemed even though I didn't pick Iron Guardian, I was still the tank. Jonathan needed to hurry up and level up, so he would be the one doing this. The hail of blows continued, and I barely weathered the storm. My hands hurt from holding the axe, and it was difficult to lift my arms. Even using Ice Wall didn't offer the respite it once did. The one time I tried to use it, the tail smashed through it with little difficulty, even reinforced as it was with ice manipulation. My axe wasn't made for this. It was an attacking weapon, not something to be used as a shield. Thinking quickly, I picked up the pieces of the broken ice wall with ice manipulation and made a shield. It had been a while since I used one, but I still knew the basics. Using as much mana as the ice could hold, I tried to defend. The ice didn't have heavy blow and penetrating strike to augment its strength, so when the tail came around, it shattered into pieces. The tail continued and impacted my chest so hard I nearly blacked out. My feet left me and I was sent tumbling across the ground. Gasping for breath, I tried to fight away the darkness encroaching on my vision. The air vacated my lungs and wouldn't come back. I was left heaving, trying to gather my lost breath back. The sudden feeling of losing the ability to breathe was so jarring I didn't even notice my breastplate flying off, dented and rent from my chest from the powerful blow. The straps couldn't take the strain and snapped. The backplate, with nothing to hold on to, fell to the ground. I was left with no chest plate while I gasped on the ground. Gathering myself as quickly as I could, I made to stand back up. The power of that blow was enough to cave in the wall with enough time. I needed to get up. I marshaled all my energy into getting back up. Watching the boss lumbering toward me, I could almost feel the smugness it undoubtedly was feeling. It had launched the gnat that had been annoying it and was now coming to finish the job. Getting my feet under me, I readied myself to continue. I let go of my axe at some point and was left weaponless and without armor. Without a better idea, I gathered back up the ice I could to defend myself. Knowing that it didn't work last time, I needed something more. Ice powered with ice manipulation wasn't enough. Trying to send heavy blow into the ice failed and all the other attacking skills wouldn't activate. It wasn't an attack I was trying to make and the skills refused to cooperate. The only thing I could think of was Ice Wall, but used on the piece I was holding. My first attempt to use the skill created a wall right in front of me instead of going into my ice shield, creating a normal ice wall. It didn't matter if it wasn't what the skill was made for. It was my skill and I would use it how I needed it. My second cast flowed where I intended it to and I felt the ice in my hands strengthen with the mana from the skill. I knew it still wasn't enough based on how easily the boss shattered my normal ice walls. The wall was too weak to hold up to the difference in ranks. Austin was launching skills at the boss while it tracked me across the field and projectiles clattered against its natural armor. Nothing was going to stop it from reaching me and I needed to come up with something to defend against it. If a wall wasn't enough, I'll build a castle. No, not a castle, a fortress. Using most of my remaining mana, I pushed against the confines of the skill. My practice with ice manipulation gathered all of the ice in my surroundings and merged it into what I was attempting to do. I didn't have enough ice. Gathering it all wasn't enough. Using hail to create more, I pushed ice manipulation to the limit, forcing it all to merge into what I wanted. If a wall was too flimsy, then try to break a fortress. In my spirit, I felt something in the structure of the skill give way. Ice Wall's skill structure expanded with a familiar feeling I had only felt once before. The mana flowed in without fighting against the confines of the skill, and the ice took on a new color. It increased in density and glistened with a pure glow. After the skill stopped fighting me, it helped merge all the ice into the defense I needed, and it was just in time. I could see through the less cloudy ice the tail already in motion coming to destroy it. The notification chime was drowned out, and I could only hope it was enough. Giving it my all, I watched the tail descend. Chapter 47 Explosive. Time seemed to slow as the tail descended, and it gave me time to watch with rapt attention as the appendage made its way toward me. I poured everything I had into getting my skill to upgrade and could only hope that it was enough. When the two finally met, cracks shot out from the impact site running in every direction. With my mana as saturated into the wall as it was, I felt it crack, I heard it crack, and I saw it crack. My fears manifested. It wasn't enough. As the cracks spread out and threatened to shatter completely, the tail ended its descent. As soon as I saw that the tail stopped, I wanted to jump for joy. It held. I thought that it was done for when the cracks started spreading and the wall was going to shatter. But it didn't. The energy of the tail dissipated as the ice cracked and absorbed the blow. My skill worked. Being as excited as I was that it worked, I didn't see the boss turn around to continue its attack. I was so focused on the one attack that I didn't think about what would follow. The lizard came around with its mouth and chomped straight through the remnants of my shield of ice. I had enough wherewithal and battle experience to react quickly, but I was a step behind. The boss clamped down on my right arm with its powerful jaws and sharp teeth easily penetrating the skill-empowered skin. Ah! I let out a scream at the sudden pain and the feeling of teeth digging into my arm. It felt like they were scraping bone, they were so deep. The pain jump-started my mind into focus and I fought through it to come up with everything I could do. I didn't have a weapon to attack, the boss was already clamped on my arm, and my mana was running low after using it to defend. I had to get the boss to let go of my arm or it would pull it off. It nearly bit it clean off and only my high fortitude stopped it. With only one thing that came to mind to get it to let go, I shoved my fist into its eye. With my free left hand, I punched it square in the eye, which was conveniently within arm's reach now that it was biting my arm. My goal was to cause as much pain as possible. I didn't have to worry about the scaly exterior if I hit somewhere that was unprotected. The boss could only watch as my fist collided with its vulnerable eye and completely ruptured it. I tried to bring its eyelids down in time to put up some defense, but it wasn't quick enough. Clear warm goo traveled down my arm and splattered onto my face. Finding myself arm deep in the eye socket of a lizard was somewhere I never imagined I'd ever find myself. The boss yelped in pain and let go of my arm, immediately trying to create distance. It wanted to protect itself from further damage and remove the intruding appendage from its eye socket. Rage was dulling the pain, but I could still feel it throbbing. I couldn't feel anything lower than my elbow on my right arm and had to look to make sure it was still attached. I sighed in relief when I found it still there. Blood was running down my arm from the many puncture wounds from the teeth, but it was still there. Reattaching a limb or regrowing a limb is something we haven't had to concern ourselves with yet. I didn't even know if we could do it. After assessing the damage, I watched the boss scramble around, shaking its head back and forth from the unexpected loss of vision. Austin took that chance to land a blow. Sunlight encased his spear and shot toward the boss. He came flying in from its blind side while the boss was trying to recover. The attack scorched some of the rocky exterior and dislodged some of it, but other than that, it was ineffective. Seeing how futile our attacks were, we went back to what we knew. Cripple it and wear it down. My arm leaked blood constantly and throbbed in pain, but I couldn't back down. The boss was weakened but not dead. Couldn't see out of one eye, and that left a huge blind spot that we could exploit. I wasn't going to be of much help attacking it, so I focused on getting its attention. A few ice bolts were enough to accomplish that. I sent them flying toward the other eye, but the boss was smart enough to dodge them. All it had to do was move out of the way and the ice would shatter against its armor. Now that I got its attention, others started to rain down their attacks. Austin sent another spear of light at it, and I saw a carpet of arrows descend from the sky. Austin's mom, Carrie, must have recovered enough to shoot arrows. An arrow came whizzing by that could only be Hal's. When the arrow impacted, it blew a good chunk of armor completely off and revealed the scales underneath. It would take time, but we could do it. Since the ice was the only thing keeping me from getting torn apart, Rachel gracefully aimed her shots away from me. She had to wait until I was far enough away or else she would melt my defenses. I ran around like a chicken with my head cut off. I didn't have the mana to stand toe-to-toe with the boss and tried to save as much of it as I could by running away from its attacks. expending as little as possible to send a few ice bolts when it turned to focus on someone else. I was huffing and puffing. My head felt woozy from the blood loss, but I pushed myself on. I needed to give them time to take it down. Arrows, magic, and anything else they could throw were launched from the wall as more and more people from the western gate came over. As I ran, I saw the attacks start to add up. More and more of its armor was falling off, and some even made it through the scales. Seeing it bleed gave me a second wind to continue running. If it could bleed, it could die. Jonathan made it back at some point and attempted to take its attention from me. I still had enough in me to keep going and was about to brush him off. The thing that changed my mind was the look in his eye. Jonathan looked resolute and like a man ready to fight to the death. Something in me resonated with it, and I knew he would be able to do it. I let him take the boss from me and searched for my axe. "Stone Aegis!" Jonathan shouted. I heard him shout the name of his skill as I ran toward where I last saw my axe. My vision wasn't on the boss anymore as I searched for my weapon and could only hope that Jonathan was up to the task. The feeling I got was new, and I didn't know if I could trust it. I went back to where I first clashed with the boss and looked around the pockets of upturned earth. It had been roughed up enough to be unrecognizable from before. Each of the boss's steps tore up more, and any missed attacks aided in the effort of destruction. The giant chunks it threw at the wall created deep craters that we would have to fill in later. Took a moment to find it, but I managed. It wasn't in the pristine condition it once was, but it was enough. Picking it up, I ran back toward the fight, ready to get back in it. I had to one-hand my axe again, but from previous experience I wasn't as bad. The boss rained down attacks on Jonathan, but the man held. He brought a shield of earth from the ground that deflected the heavy attacks. Austin was still trying to pierce through the scales, but was making headway. I could tell from where the scales were scorched and burnt where he was attacking. I had just gotten back into the fight when an order rang out from the wall. "Back off. We're using the traps." Granddad's authoritative voice carried over the battlefield. I couldn't help but wince remembering what traps he was talking about. After the 10th wave, there were contingency plans in place if the monsters were to breach the wall again. We purchased traps from the store that lay dormant under the wall in case of emergency. I wouldn't classify now as an emergency, but it wasn't my decision. The activation of the traps was in the hands of the faction head, Granddad. Picturing how he was seeing the battle made it make more sense to activate them. Blood was flowing freely from my arm, and I could only use one hand to swing my axe. Everyone had to be running low on mana from the battle, and Hal wasn't shooting as much. Rachel's fireballs were coming more infrequently. To Granddad, we were losing the battle of attrition. I wanted to scream and shout that it was fine. We didn't need to waste the points, but it wouldn't work. As battle-worn as I looked, my opinion would be dismissed, and continuing to fight would only lead to more injuries. Injuries we didn't need. Austin and I made our retreat to the wall, and I could tell that he was unhappy with the decision as well. After we were both on the wall, Jonathan made his retreat. Calling it a retreat and not running for his life was gracious. As soon as he grabbed hold of the rope, Austin and I heaved him up. The boss could do little more than watch as we all climbed up to safety. Seeing all of its targets leave, it lumbered toward the wall to knock it down. Throughout the fight, I had dragged it around the field and distanced it from the wall that it was now closing. As it got closer to where the traps were buried, the tension built. The traps were upgraded after the pylon upgrade and were extremely powerful from the one time that we tested them. It was called an explosive trap in the store, and once armed, it would explode when the next thing stepped on it. When we bought it, it set up intricate magical connections between the explosive device and the ground above it. It was essentially a magically empowered landmine. There were still chunks and pieces of armor on the boss, but it had depreciated enough to leave a decent-sized opening for the explosion to be fatal. When we tested it, F-ranked beasts weren't what we envisioned it being used against. We had enough buried that it would hit one as it marched toward the wall and might even hit two with its size. Buying that many traps put a dent into our savings for the wall, but they would be useless if they weren't activated. There was a manual switch we could use, but that didn't solve the issue of it being in the wrong spot. As the boss closed in on the target zone, everyone's nerves reached new highs. I was so captivated by watching it get closer I didn't even feel it when Abigail started healing my arm. One step after the next and it shuffled toward the bomb. When it finally hit the spot, the explosion was immediate. The force rocked the walls and sent me stumbling back, barely left standing. White encapsulated my vision and I had to blink it away to see the damage. Others weren't as lucky and were thrown back from the force. Even as far away as we were, the force was still great. As my vision cleared and the ringing in my ears died down, I saw the crater it left behind. The boss lost the foot directly above the trap and blood saturated the ground where it was. It was blown over by the force and didn't look to be getting back up. Its chest was caved in and it looked like hell. All of us stared dumbfounded at the outcome. The explosion was bigger than anticipated and the common tear trap was more violent than we thought. It seemed its egregious price tag was well-founded. As the minutes passed and the boss lost blood, the notification chime brought us out of our stupor. The wave was over. You have slain Rock Salamander. Level 2400 points earned. You have slain Rock Salamander. Level 21. 441 points earned. You have slain Rock Salamander. Level 2400 points earned. You have contributed in slaying Rock Salamander. Level 2098 points earned. You have contributed in slaying Lesser Rock Drake. Level 2567 points earned. You have successfully defended your claim. Extra experience awarded. For 1,000 points to all who participated. Congratulations. You have leveled up. Only one level was extremely disappointing and the pitiful amount of points for the boss was a ripoff. I knew we didn't land the killing blow and relied on traps, but it should be more than this. If the points distributed were that low, thinking about the lost experience made me gnash my teeth. So much experience was wasted. To make myself feel better, I brought up the notification I got mid-battle about my skill upgrade. You have upgraded a skill. Ice Wall, Common, Dash, Ice Fortress, Uncommon. Ice Fortress, Uncommon. Creates a barrier of ice at the designated area. Height and width are determined at the time of activation. Maximum area and thickness are determined by mastery of the skill along with skill rarity. Another skill upgraded. Now all I needed to do was figure out how to upgrade the rest. And I was one level closer to my evolution. I only had one more level to work with before it was too late. Chapter 48 Jinx. Took a long time for my arm to heal, but it wasn't as bad as the last time. Meditation eased the burden on the healers and boosted my vitality to heal the wound faster. I received feeling back in the hand after a few hours and fully healed a few more after. Since the wave ended so explosively, we had a lot of cleanup to do. The wall needed to be repaired as the blast was close enough to damage it, but that was only a matter of points, not manpower. The trench had caved in, but at this point it was more superficial than anything. As the beasts got stronger, the threat of the trench waned. It wasn't the insurmountable obstacle it once was. There were still traps that we made that had to be reset after the wave, and we would have to purchase more from the store to make up for the ones we used. It seemed the threat of an F rank was higher than we thought. None of that concerned me, though. It seemed a little arrogant to say, but I left that to the others. I needed to focus on meditation and healing more than I needed to help clean up. I noticed my thought process changing the longer that this hell went on. Before, I would think that I needed to do my fair share and help pitch in. Now, I knew I had better things to do and to leave that task to the others. This wave brought with it the needed points to finally upgrade the wall. 250,000 points was a lot to save up, but over 4 waves worth of monsters, it became feasible. The clear rewards just kept climbing every wave and resulted in the bulk of our points to spend. 27 people getting over 1,000 points each was a lot of points. Someone did the math and figured out the pattern behind where the number came from. It took the lowest level monster that the wave spawned and multiplied its point value by 10. So if the lowest level in the wave was level 10, it would take the points it was worth, 100, and multiply it by 10. This resulted in a wave completion reward of 1,000 points for every person who participated. I thought it was wrong to go based on the lowest level instead of the highest level, but I wasn't the one who made it. If there was someone who made it, I knew that not every group in this tutorial was a family and that not every family was as close as ours was, and that made me wonder what would happen to the points of people who didn't pull their weight. Say a group had people who didn't fight or were bad at it, would they force them to give up the points from completing the wave? I could see this going badly if the ties between group members were weaker. I didn't much care how other people dealt with it. We had our method and it was working so far. 50% was enough for now and they could keep the rest. If more was needed later, we would ask for more. A small piece of me wanted to hoard their points so I could buy more skills, but that wouldn't be right. We weren't that desperate yet. Plus, it wouldn't result in that many skills. After the two I bought at 5,000 points each, the cost went up again. The system seemed hell-bent on not making this easy. 25,000 for a skill was outrageous. I knew one that I had to save up for already, and I cringed every time I thought about the price increasing again. Admittedly, for skills were a lot to be able to purchase. Taking into account that you only got 6 per rank, that was 2/3 the amount of an entire rank. I was just biased at the ease of the first few. A part of me did wonder how much these skills would go for outside of the tutorial. The supply had to be huge based on the sheer number of worlds in the multiverse. The alien said in the class that there were an uncountable number of worlds in the multiverse and trying to come up with a number was futile. New ones formed and others were destroyed enough to make counting inaccurate. Plus, integrations created a massive influx of new worlds, and there were 150 of those before making ours the 151st. Being the 151st had a nice ring to it. It was said that skill shards could be found in dungeons and skill books could be made by a person of significant power who had mastered the skill. I wasn't sure how many dungeons were on a planet, but even if it was one, that was still a lot of skill shards. Even with the massive supply, that said nothing of the demand. On uncountable worlds, there had to be uncountable people who needed skills. Common skills might not be that hard to find, but even thinking about rare or higher skills made me shudder. With my current amount of wealth, it would be a while before I would be in a position to worry about that. I still wasn't clear on how to actually earn money. Hunting beasts for materials had to pay well, but how much was a beast worth? Especially the low-ranked ones I would be hunting for the foreseeable future. I could make things with my profession, but there had to be trillions of blacksmiths in the multiverse. Ugh! This was making my head hurt. There had to be rules to it, or low-leveled worlds would be screwed. The one skill I knew I needed was mana engraving, or something similar so that I could push my profession toward the enchanter side. I wasn't confident that it would work, but it wouldn't hurt to try. At worst, I would be a blacksmith with a rudimentary ability to enchant. The skill cost was steep, but ultimately worth it in my opinion. 25,000 was a lot to spend on a maybe, but I didn't know what else to spend it on. I could make my own armor and weapons, so I didn't have to buy them. I already had most of the class skills I currently needed. Buying more information would be useful, but that's what the rest of my family wanted to spend their points on. They needed to know what was happening to the Earth. I was curious, but not enough to buy the information. We would find out after the 3 months regardless. I would also have to buy the Enchanter Profession Starter just for good measure. If it was anything like the blacksmithing one I read, then it should give me some valuable insight into evolving in that direction. None of that was what I needed to worry about currently. I needed to fix the blank spot on my status, and I only had one more level of leeway to get it done. I wasn't entirely certain how evolving worked and if it would generate the options once I hit level 25 or if I could still do more to change the outcome. I didn't want to leave anything to chance though, so I wanted to make sure I had a law before hitting level 25. Evolving was weird. When I hit level 10, I got my last class skill for my H-ranked class, then I got the choice to evolve. After evolving, I got another skill. 2 skills for 1 level seemed like a lot. I wonder if the lack of requirements is the reason. In the class about the basics, the alien said that there were requirements to evolve your rank. Maybe there was a larger time gap between reaching the maximum level for a rank and when you evolved. If you hit level 100 and maxed out your class but were short on the requirements to evolve, it might take a while before you were ready. Plus, the extra skill was like a reward for meeting the requirements. It's like a reward, huh? Regardless, that's what I was doing currently. Packing stuff to make the trip into the mountains. I didn't want to bother Austin with it since I didn't know how long it would take, so I anticipated going alone. Based on how difficult the boss was to fight, I planned to avoid altercations and avoid the attention of any of the beasts. I planned to reach where the snow and ice felt right and meditate on it. I knew the monsters wouldn't be as hard to fight as the boss since they wouldn't be as powerful, but it was still something I wanted to ignore. I wouldn't get any time to gain enlightenment if I spent the whole time fighting. I still wasn't great at the meditation part, but it was my best idea. I had more of a clue about what to do after the boss fight, but I wasn't exactly certain. It was something I felt before I upgraded my skill during my desperate fight with the boss. It was when I needed to make the ice stronger that I glimpsed something odd. I was trying to make my ice denser and colder to make it as strong as possible, and I had a feeling I was brushing against something completely different than a skill upgrade. It felt more fundamental and rooted deeply in the laws of physics, if that made any sense. Wait, is it even considered the laws of physics anymore? Those were thoroughly broken and magic danced on their grave. Everything we thought we knew went out the window when mana arrived. Flinging fireballs around wasn't something the laws of physics were built around. There still had to be rules on how everything worked, but they wouldn't be called the laws of physics anymore. It would be something more like the laws of reality. As I had the thought, I wanted to slap myself. I was being stupid. They were literally called laws. No shit, Sherlock. I didn't dwell on my stupidity any longer and gathered everything that I thought I might need. An extra cloak made out of wolf pelt for the weather, food for a 2-day trip. I still needed to be back in time for the 16th wave. A canteen of water I purchased from the store. Not the water part, just the canteen. With my stats, sleeping outside wouldn't be an issue, but it still wouldn't be comfortable. A small tent and bedroll were enough to fix that issue. I didn't plan on fighting, but I would be a fool not to bring my axe. I still needed to work on a better weapon, but that would come after the time crunch of my evolution was behind me. This would be the last axe I would use, and it made my vision linger on it as I picked it up. It was my companion in a lot of fights, but it would be the last. They were becoming too impractical. My strength was too much for the metal to handle, and I wasn't keeping up with my blacksmithing skills to compensate for the difference. Hammers would be easier. If I were a better blacksmith, I could probably make it work. But I wasn't. Real blacksmiths hadn't been a thing since the Industrial Revolution. They still existed, but weren't as prominent as they once had been. Forged in Fire was a great show to watch, but nothing for industrial use was made by a blacksmith anymore. Machines took over that process and have only been growing in usage. Automation was a marvel to watch, but the side effects were hard to ignore. How much of a step up would we have if we still did things by hand? We wouldn't be going into these professions with zero knowledge if blacksmiths and apothecaries were still around. It was a vain thought to have, but that didn't make it untrue. In the grand scheme of things, the impracticality of artisan workers would have limited industry too much for the benefits now to be worth it. I considered taking my blacksmithing tools, but figured I wouldn't need them. There wasn't a way for me to make a fire hot enough for it to be worth it, and carrying an anvil was impractical. Plus, I still wasn't planning on fighting anything. If I didn't plan on using my weapon, then I wouldn't need my tools to repair it. Did I mention that I didn't plan on fighting anything? Chapter 49, To the Mountains. Whose stupid idea was this? Entirely out of breath, I couldn't help but voice my question to my surroundings. This was also ignoring the fact that I was alone, and this was, in fact, my idea. I didn't know why I thought I would be able to sneak anywhere. Every beast I came across knew exactly where I was, and they didn't take my intrusion into their territory lightly. I moved as quietly as I could, making sure not to step on any branches or sticks that would make noise. I even made sure to travel so the wind wouldn't carry my scent ahead of me. Having no experience in trying to sneak was a factor I didn't consider when I initially made this plan. I thought that the experience of hunting with Austin would be enough to sneak by without having to fight everything I came across. Either the beasts up here were better at detecting me, or I wasn't as good as I thought I was. I had a feeling it was a bit of both, but more toward the latter. When we went hunting, we were actively looking for a fight, so it didn't stand out to us when our stealth failed. Now that stealth was the goal, every time it failed, it was a fight I didn't want. Having zero stealth skills in my repertoire was another factor that I considered to be the reason. I didn't think I was that bad at sneaking, but the beasts reacted to me well before they should have. It was like they sensed my presence from a distance and knew I was there. It was unfair. Bears roared and charged at me when I intruded on their territory. Wolves and big cats threw themselves at me when I passed. Even gophers popped out of burrows to attack me. It was like I was carrying a neon sign that said "Attack me." Even a few fish nipped at me when I crossed a river. Everything took their chance to hinder my trip as I passed by their territory. If I wasn't in a time crunch, I would show them why that was a bad idea, but I had to move on before more showed up. I regretted not bringing my blacksmithing tools. My armor could use a servicing and so could my axe. None of the beasts so far were above level 25, but they would get there soon. The further I went away from camp, the higher the level the beasts were. They started at level 15 and quickly rose to over level 20 as I continued further toward the mountains. I noticed there weren't any lower-level animals anymore. That was another thing I had failed to anticipate. The mountains were a lot farther away than they appeared to the eye. When looked at from the camp, they looked like normal mountains, but as I got closer, I found out how big they really were. Their peaks breached the clouds and continued further than my eye could see. Having misjudged the distance I would need to travel, I had to pick up the pace. I left on the morning after Wave 15, Day 44, and had to be back before noon on Day 46 for the 16th wave. That left the entirety of Day 44, the day I left, and Day 45 to accomplish what I needed, before booking it back on the third day before noon. If it took longer than anticipated, I would have to forego sleep. Sleep deprivation worked differently with stats than before. It depended on how active you were if you needed to sleep. With an endurance stat over 80, a few sleepless nights wouldn't kill me, but if I spent the entire time fighting for my life, I would be dead on my feet. I was usually so active during the day that a few hours of sleep were necessary to keep going. I kept my sleeping hours tied to the sun to make the most of my time as I could. Hunting in the dark was asking for an injury, and I couldn't forge because of all the noise, so I usually went to sleep a few hours after sundown. I spent those hours on mana manipulation and perception training. I woke at sunrise, a scant few hours later, and went about my day. It usually left me with a good 5 to 6 hours of sleep that were enough to keep me going. The exhaustion was building up, though, and the short stints of sleep weren't enough to keep me fresh. It only put off the inevitable. Sooner or later I would have to rest, but I put it off. After this tutorial was over, I could sleep for however long I wanted. I just had to get there first. It took most of Day 44 just to get to the mountains. Eventually, I just sprinted past everything, disregarding stealth completely. Some of the beasts were faster than me, but not all of them, and they were just as keen to fight each other as they were me. I couldn't keep up my snail's pace if I wanted to reach the mountains in a timely manner. Never one for cardio, it was my stats that were the only thing keeping me going. Before, I used to say the only way to get me to run was if something was chasing me. Now that I was running toward the mountain, that was technically true. Things were chasing me. After reaching the mountain, I had to drop my pace because of the incline and climbing I had to do. That also involved fighting everything that caught up, which took more time. What kind of idiot thought I wouldn't be fighting anything? It was with blood covering me that I started my hike up the mountain. The first thing I did was wash myself in a small stream coming down the mountain. Having blood covering me was just asking for a fight I didn't want, so I aimed to fix that. I submerged myself into the stream to wash more than just my armor, and boy was it cold. I didn't think anything of it at the time and jumped right into the water thinking it wouldn't be that bad. Fortitude had improved my ability to withstand the cold, and I figured I'd be fine. As soon as I hit the water, I felt the chilling cold invade my body. It sapped all of my heat and soaked my clothes in what felt like sub-zero water. I shot out of the water as fast as I could and couldn't help shivering. Even with my affinity and stats, the cold was making me shiver. Good, this is what I wanted. It was good that I was cold. This was the feeling I wanted to meditate on. Some way to make my ice colder. I could feel the mana change as I climbed higher. My mana senses weren't the best, but even I could feel the stark change. Plant and nature mana fell away to ice and water. Wind mana was prominent as well. It was refreshing to breathe in. Closing my eyes and inhaling deeply, I could feel the tension in my body melt away. The adrenaline from the fights leading here flushed from my system, and I felt lighter on my feet. The change in mana was also reflected in the beasts I found. Fur thickened and changed color, with more white hues that blended in with the snow than the browns of the forest. Elk and deer had white fur that blended into the surroundings and had antlers that looked like ice crystals. Snow foxes prowled the lands for prey and snowbirds circled the skies. Worst of all, they passed the level 25 threshold. Identify was my best friend and I kept it constantly active. Now that I reached my destination, I needed to find a quiet spot without anything to bother me. As I continued up the mountain, my breath started to plume out into fog that was visible in the air, and I knew this was what I needed. The cold burn in the back of the throat when inhaling and the temperature so cold you could smell it. The crispness that the air carried along with the piercing winds that seemed to disregard clothing. This was the spot. I felt at home. The snow was over a foot deep and I could see for miles. I was so high up. It was harder to breathe from the elevation, but nothing my stats couldn't handle. I got tired quicker, but my endurance powered through. The beasts were scarce up here, and only a few fights hindered my hike up the mountain. The view was marvelous. The sun was halfway through its descent in the sky and created a beautiful sight on its way down. The mountains on either side continued climbing out of sight with vast forests to look down upon to the south. There were fewer monsters up here, and they were less aggressive to my presence. My plan of finding a quiet spot to meditate wasn't as far-fetched as my trip here would indicate. I didn't even clear the area of snow before I sat down to take it all in. I knew the area was clear of any animals from a quick survey, and I could take my time to experience it all. I had to go around a few animals traveling up the mountain, but it was nothing compared to the trip here. I felt free. The stress from the impending waves fell away, and the feeling of loss went away for the moment. The constant worry for my family disappeared, and the only thing I was left with was the snowy mountain I was on. Snow-covered fields of white that reflected enough light to look luminescent. Reluctant to move from my spot, I put off setting up my camp for later. I just sat in the snow and relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. I didn't know how long I stayed like that, but my back started to hurt from the way I was sitting. Sitting cross-legged wasn't a comfortable position to be in for extended periods of time. It was long enough for the sun to dip into the horizon until sunset was near. A full day of travels led me here, and the feeling of accomplishment wasn't small. After the rocky start to my trip, I thought it would only get worse. I was glad that wasn't the case. My stomach rumbled, prompting me to finally get up. I ate a quick meal of dried meat and took the time to set up my camp before it got dark. The tent was easy to set up and only took a few minutes. After my meal, it was time to figure out how to do this. The first thing I needed was a place to sit. There was no chance I was doing a lotus position or whatever the new Zen posture was. That was the single most uncomfortable position I think the human body can be in. My knees didn't bend like that, and the whole process was unpleasant, to put it mildly. How someone can sit like that for an extended period of time boggled my mind. If it was torture you were into, just call it that. Don't try to play it off as meditation like it was relaxing. I needed something with a back and didn't bring any chairs with me. A smirk worked its way on my face, and I pulled with ice manipulation to make it happen. The snow around me jumped to answer my call and started packing itself together. Clumps gathered together with other clumps building up to something bigger. The base started to take shape before extruding into the air. A wide base for stability built up to the first ledge a few feet off the ground before rising further, angled away from the ledge. With the practice I put into ice manipulation, this amount of work was trivial. Snow continued working itself together into what I envisioned, and before long, it was finished. Ah, perfect, I said joyously before taking a seat in my newly made furniture. I made some slight adjustments for comfort before putting on the finishing touches for flair. A throne of snow now decorated the mountain, and no, I wasn't ashamed to call it that. Well, it's more beanbag shaped than throne shaped. Honestly, it was a giant beanbag of snow that was extremely comfortable to sit in. I can call it whatever I want. I made it more for comfort than anything, and a throne would be worse than sitting on the ground. Okay, now all I have to do is figure out this meditation thing. How hard could it be? Chapter 50: Ice That Would Last. Hours passed. A few more hours passed. The first rays of sunlight started to peek over the horizon. What am I doing wrong? Exasperation colored my tone. I had been at this for the entire night and the sun was already beginning to rise. A full night with nothing to show for it. I tried everything I could think of to gain enlightenment and comprehend a law, but nothing worked. I spent most of my time just exploring the feeling I had during the boss fight. Something about it made it feel like it was the right direction, but no matter what I did, it remained elusive. To make my ice denser, I had to make it colder. Those two were linked somehow and I didn't know how. I knew the science behind it, but that did little to help. As things got colder, molecules slowed down and got closer together, therefore becoming denser. I knew that theoretically it was practically that I was having trouble. Having magic powers for a little over a month wasn't enough time to learn the ins and outs I needed to make this easier. To make something denser, the space between the atoms needed to shrink. The same amount of mass had to take up less space. Simple math. Except compressing it did absolutely nothing. Every time I tried to squeeze the ice I was manipulating, it would shatter. Every attempt to make my ice denser resulted in ice shards exploding in my face. There was something I was missing, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. After repeated failures trying to compress the ice, I tried to make it colder. Ice by itself wasn't really that cold in the grand scheme of things, but if I could decrease the temperature, it would do more damage. I didn't know the exact time it took for frostbite to set in for normal snow, but it was all dependent on temperature. I'd spent many a day in the snow throwing snowballs without gloves on and had all my fingers still working. The current ice I summoned was like normal mundane snow and ice that fell from the sky during winter. I needed it to be more like what fell in the Arctic Circle on the coldest of winter days that only took moments for permanent damage to set in. I wanted a way for it to be more damaging. Knowing it was possible and accomplishing it were two different things. The skill description for Frostbite came out and said it was possible. Frostbite, uncommon. Augment your blows with ice mana, injecting whatever hit with a chilling cold. Adds to the penetrating power of your strikes while leaving a cold damage over time effect. Lasting damage over time was the exact effect I was going for. If I could get the law that strengthened my ice, then I could accomplish what the skill did manually. Sadly, it ended in more failure. Pushing more mana into the ice didn't make it any colder, it just created more. Ice manipulation didn't work the way I was trying to make it. Picking up a piece of ice with it and shoving mana into it didn't do what I intended. It was more like my sense metal skill. The more mana I sent into the ice, the closer I felt to it. I felt the crystals more closely and the imperfections in the way they froze. It was like putting it under a magnifying glass and telling me all its secrets. Stray thoughts plagued me the entire time. Questions came up with every action I took, and I didn't have the information to answer them. When I used hail, where did the ice come from? Did it draw in and freeze the moisture in the air? If that was the case, how did I create so much of it? A few casts of ice wall would drain the surroundings of moisture. If it wasn't from the moisture in the air, where did it come from? Was it conjured up from the mana spent on the skill? If that was the case, why did it feel so real? For all intents and purposes, the ice felt real. It melted in the warm temperature, it was cold to the touch, and it cracked and shattered like ice. With my level of power, it was indistinguishable from normal ice. My thoughts spiraled further after that line of questioning. If my ice was real, what about other mana conjurations? Could a metal skill create actual metal? How would the market for that work economically? Would anyone mine for metal again? My mind wouldn't settle down. All of the questions I had bottled up since the start of the tutorial came to the surface now that I had the time to relax and think about them. It was slightly infuriating to have it happen now when I wished to be thinking about something else. At the start, a part of me let my mind wander so I could get a break from the futility of what I was doing, and now getting it to stop after I started down the rabbit hole was difficult. Instead of trying to refocus my mind, I attempted something different. I had felt it ever since I entered the snowy region of the mountain, and I wished to explore it more. The surrounding ice mana felt pure and untainted from most other mana types, which made my body feel great. It was like sitting in a sauna. Every breath was easier, and I could feel the mana working its way through my system. Over the previous days, tracking the mana flowing through me got easier, and meditation helped tremendously. It helped me focus inward and watch the mana as it flowed around my body in a circuit. There was a specific circulatory system specifically for mana that ran all the way through my body, reaching every spot. Thick branches split off into my appendages before splitting further into my phalanges. Looking at it deeply with meditation showed that the mana in my system was mainly ambient mana or neutral mana. Mana without an affinity. There was still ice mana there, but it wasn't as prominent as I thought it would be. There wasn't a lot we knew about affinities, and at first, I thought that they would make all the mana in my system into that type of mana. Over time, I realized that way of thinking was wrong. After I spent an amount of mana, my body worked to pull more of it from the surroundings to replenish it. Whatever affinity the mana was in the area was what I pulled in. In camp, it was majority plant and earth, with nature and wind there as well, but not as common as plant and earth. My body pulled in the mana and set about cleansing it. I first noticed this when I was injured and had slept for almost an entire day. That 17-hour sleep was the longest time I had gone without using mana. After seeing what happened, I made time to investigate further and discuss what I found with Rachel. She was the leading expert we had with all things relating to magic, and we came up with what we thought was the answer. The affinity a person had worked kind of like dialysis. It took in and filtered the mana in the body, getting rid of other affinities, or cleansing it, before working to raise the purity of the mana that remained. It would first remove the affinity of unwanted mana, then turn it into the preferred mana. After doing that, it would work to raise its purity. The only problem was I never gave it enough time to truly turn it into the ice mana I was experiencing here. I always used it so fast that my affinity had little time to do more than color it. If we were in an area of ice and snow, then it would be fine, but we weren't. The area we were in was detrimental to my affinity, and I was finally feeling the difference here. Austin had the same problem, but his was easier to fix. Solar affinity was everywhere while the sun was up. It was just the process of making sure you absorbed it instead of the plant mana that was around it. Using meditation, it was possible to manually direct what mana you absorbed, but it took a lot of effort until you got used to it. I never bothered with it because it didn't matter what mana I took in. None of it was useful. I had heard Austin complain about it being difficult to Rachel while we practiced, and I couldn't help but make fun of him. It was possible to do it without using meditation, but it took a level of skill that required training. Most of the time we practiced, Rachel would sit around the campfire for the fire mana it released. That led to another discovery. Opposite mana types took longer to cleanse. It took longer for my affinity to work through the fire mana than it did with the others. After making fun of Austin for complaining about how hard it was to absorb specific mana, I had to eat my words when I found out how difficult it was. I wasn't even trying to absorb specific affinities. All I was doing was trying not to absorb the fire mana. Even with the lessened difficulty, it still took a while to get the hang of it. None of that I had to worry about here though. All around me was ice mana with only a few undertones of other affinities. The snow carried with it a hint of water mana, and the occasional breeze brought wind mana. The sun in the sky created solar mana, and the moon did the same for lunar. Dusk and dawn brought shadow mana that varied in density throughout the day. There weren't a lot of trees up on the mountain, and there weren't many shadows to be found. It was when the shadows were cast from the nearby mountains that shadow mana was the most commonly found. There were others as well, but those were the main ones. All of them were smothered by ice mana though, and it was exactly what I wanted. I used it to flush out my system of other affinities and leave only the pure ice mana behind. I wanted to saturate my body in it to connect with it on a deeper level. If meditating didn't work, I would seek other ways to deepen my connection with ice mana. It carried with it a feeling of rejuvenation, and it felt like getting a full body message. This was the first time my entire system was filled with ice mana, and I dreaded the thought of leaving. I spent a long while just basking in the feeling. Without time to waste, I didn't dally long. I let my actions flow and worked more on instinct than anything else. I pulled some of the snow together into the air in front of me. I wanted to create the perfect ice. Sending my mana into the blob of snow, I worked to condense it down into ice while also using my mana to sense what was happening. When the ice crystals didn't align, I broke it and did it again. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted none of the imperfections that I felt when saturating it with my mana. none of the deficiencies in the crystalline structure. It was like making something in the forge to the best of my ability. This piece of ice would be my masterpiece. Letting my mind wander and only really focusing on the structure of the ice, I wasn't aware of what I was making. Without my conscious mind to guide it, my subconscious took over. Thoughts of how I was going to prepare my next weapon had filled my thoughts for a while and imprinted the design onto my subconscious. A long handle of ice 5 feet long built itself into reality, constantly breaking apart before being formed again. Any imperfections would not be tolerated. Every destruction and consequent reconstruction took time, but I didn't notice. My mind was somewhere else and didn't notice the sun streaking across the sky at a quick pace. The handle was about wrist thick, and after it extended out 5 feet, the changes shifted to one end. The hammerhead would be the coup de grace of my work, so I saved it for last. The other end needed some ornamentation and couldn't be left as it was. When I designed the warhammer in my mind, I thought of a few ways to cap the other end. Many things could have worked, but I went for the most common. A weighted ball on the end to provide some semblance of balance while also giving me the option to hit things with it. Using it as a weapon wouldn't be its main purpose, but it was still a possibility, like the butt end of a spear. Making it a perfect sphere would work, but I wanted to add a little flair, so I flattened 2 sides of it for room to add a marker. In the few times I let my mind wander to the possibilities of what was to come when we returned to Earth, I fantasized about heraldry. Ancient knights with coats of arms and sigils were used throughout most of history and were the mark of a family or clan. Family sigils from Game of Thrones came to mind, and I wanted to make one for myself. They weren't used anymore and our family didn't have one, but I still thought they were cool. I imprinted a miniature version onto both sides of the pommel before moving on to the head. The sigil was so small that no one would be able to tell it was there except me, but that was all that mattered. Moving to the head created the hardest difficulty. I needed to connect it to the shaft in such a way that it wouldn't snap off when I hit something. I reinforced that area with as much ice as I could without hindering the final product. Still not aware of what I was making, the ice grew out into 2 massive hammerheads to either side. I made it symmetrical along the handle axis so that it was balanced. Both hammerheads grew from the center, breaking and reforming where it was appropriate, and the ice didn't form correctly. From my experience in the forge, my subconscious knew that the face of the hammer needed to be hardened. If this were metal, I would quench the weapon to harden the steel. Since this was ice, I couldn't do that. I kept breaking the ice that formed and trying again. Nothing I made was right, and my mind worked on autopilot to break it down. I needed it harder. I needed it denser. I needed it colder. I required a weapon that would hold up to my strength. I needed one that wouldn't break against the waves. I needed a weapon that would help me protect my family. I threw everything into making it the best weapon I could. All of my thoughts and feelings, my worries and regrets, my hopes and prayers. I pushed with my entire spirit to make it the best weapon I could. It was almost there. I could feel it. I was just missing one more thing. To make an ice that would last, I needed one to be able to last through the seasons. Normal ice wouldn't work. That ice wasn't meant to last. It would melt when the rains of spring and the heat of summer came. No, I needed ice that would last. Ice from the poles that had stood the test of time and had lasted. Ice that had been around for millions of years. I was an Arctic barbarian. I needed Arctic ice. I pushed with everything I had, and sweat began to build up on my brow. Even in the cold, I was working up a sweat. The ice I required took time to form, and I didn't want to rush the process. I sat and pushed for what felt like hours. The sun had long set, and it would be soon time for me to leave. I knew I was close, just a little more time. My mind threatened to give out, but I pushed through it. Ice manipulation was taking its toll, and keeping it active for so long made my mind feel like it was splitting apart. My spirit strained against what I was putting it through, but I didn't give up. I finally knew what I needed, and there was no way I was going to give up now. I needed this to protect my family, and I would sooner die than give up. It was when the sun started to rise that I finally felt it. At first, I thought the pressure I was putting on it shattered the ice, but I was wrong. It condensed down and became the ice I needed it to be. It would stand the test of time. A notification chimed in the background and I felt a new connection with my surroundings snap into place, but I didn't worry about any of that. My mind needed a break and my spirit was on its last legs. I needed to rest. It was with a sense of accomplishment that I laid on the ground to rest. Worrying about the cold was a thing of the past and I covered myself with snow before closing my eyes. I never did use that tent. End of chapter 50.